we got hit with this yesterday, and it's a monumental piece of news. According to Kombat, which has now been confirmed in reports on MMA Junkie, MMA Fighting, I think even the UFC kind of acknowledged it was true at this point through social media postings, Jose Aldo has retired. Jose Aldo has retired. Now, he, according to Kombat, had one fight left on his deal. The understanding that I have, according to that report, is that he would be allowed if he wanted to do like sport jiu-jitsu or maybe even boxing, but he couldn't obviously go sign with another MMA promoter. That would be out of the question. We will see what happens. BC, your reaction to this news, and more broadly, what is Jose Aldo's legacy in the sport if this is the actual last MMA fight that he has?
First of all, reaction to the news, I am surprised. Knowing the competitor he is, we talked about it last week, I assumed he would be the kind of guy you'd have to remove from the sport because he's always going to get the most of himself. In a training camp, in a fight, his move down in weight so late in age to become a legitimate title contender multiple times at Bantamweight here. I'm surprised. I kind of feel like, he's still going to want to go out on his own terms in Brazil one day, but if he never fights again, as you so mentioned earlier last week, is it the right time? In some ways, he's kind of going out on top. I know he's coming off a loss, but going out late in his career in the deepest division in the sport's history, that close to a title shot. But what's the legacy of the great King of Rio, Jose Rio? It's just that he's royalty in this space. Whether you have him in the top 5, you probably could have him no worse than the top 10 of fighters in this sport's history. I think that what jumps out you first in terms of like the first line of his accomplishments is he was the face of a division for a decade, basically. Became a devastating star in the WEC, was moved right into full UFC title championship mode without needing to win it because of how dominant he was. And then that run of title defenses, he went nearly a full decade without losing. He was always class. He was always about the purest elements of this game, respect, hard work. But what's my personal legacy for Jose? It's actually more of what he did when things weren't fully going in his direction. The way mentally that he bounced back from the one-punch knockout loss and all the trash talk against Conor McGregor and the aforementioned reinvention at Bantamweight. Here's a guy who just never stopped trying to be great no matter the circumstances. And more often than not, like 80% of the times, it seems like when he intended to go out there and be great, he figured out a way to do exactly just that. I could not have more respect for a fighter who, after those 2 losses to Max Holloway, I kind of question even then, could he be done? Or would we see a marked drop-off? He just kept finding ways to siphon whatever greatness was left inside of him. And maybe that's why I fear he really isn't done yet. But regardless of what he wants to do next, I'll be behind him, and I have nothing but the utmost respect as a man, as a competitor, for somebody who, even if his accomplishments may not necessarily put him in your Mount Rushmore or my Mount Rushmore, not only is he close, but he stands for everything that a great champion should in so many ways. Maybe short of that tattoo on his right arm, but that's more of your beef than mine. I love me some Jose Aldo.
Yeah, I share all that analysis. I would add a few different things. Now, in the end, who ended up doing great beyond WEC, but was a WEC fighter? For example, Demetrius Johnson fought in WEC, but I don't think he really hit his stride until the flyweight division really started cooking in UFC, and he moved over there, right? Like, even then, he was still fighting Dominic Cruz at bantamweight as late as 2011. But if you're talking like WEC runs, who had the best one? Jose Aldo is probably your number one choice. He had 8 fights in the WEC, won a title. All of those are by stoppage except for one, which was the Faber fight, which was an absolute shellacking from pillar to post. I don't think Jose Aldo lost a minute of that fight, much less a round. So you're talking about arguably, and I would say almost definitively, the very best WEC fighter of all time. That's the first thing I'd say. Second of all, he came not from that very first generation of Brazilians, the Nogueiras, the Babalu Sobrals, the shoot-to-box teams, the Brazilian top teams. He didn't come from that, but he came from the very next generation of them. So I would still put him somewhat in a bit of a pioneer category, certainly a very important component of the growth and development and popularity of Brazilian MMA. I would also say one thing that really, really gets lost with Jose is we talk about how good he was and all of his accomplishments. We should talk about how he changed fighting. In other words, we talk about how Khabib changed fighting with his focus on grappling, the techniques he used, and how everyone is trying to play catch up with what he did. We talk about George St. Pierre, who never really wrestled in any kind of academic or scholastic program, and nevertheless was able to shut people down or use wrestling in a way where he could beat even the Josh Koscheck's Division I national champions of the world. Jose Aldo, to me, doesn't get a lot of credit for developing the game. Now, he didn't really have offensive takedowns in that way. His takedown defense for a guy who never wrestled is arguably the best maybe ever in MMA. It is shocking how good he was. And he showed that you don't have to come from those backgrounds, even in the lighter weight categories, to be able to do that effectively. And the way in which he did it and his understanding of it. I had people who covered wrestling they're not professional wrestling, but they covered, freestyle wrestling and folk style wrestling. And they did that for their jobs. And they were telling me, like, who stands out to you? They'd be like, Jose Aldo's takedown defense. It looks like he's been wrestling all his life. Ringcraft, the way he was able to advance the game in that particular department. A guy who was a brown belt world champion in jiu-jitsu, beat Cobrinha, and then was still nevertheless a devastating Muay Thai fighter and super athletic as well. He developed the game. He improved the game by virtue of his participation. And you could very much argue, we're asking about legacy here, BC, and this is a matter of debate. There's no ironclad rule about it. It's not written in stone, but I would argue he's probably in the 5 best fighters of all time, right? Probably in the 5 best fighters of all time. I would also say, even though he was beaten by Volkanovski and he was beaten by Max, and obviously the loss to Conor McGregor hurt his legacy, I think, a lot, his record as a featherweight champion is, to this point, still better than anyone else's record as a featherweight champion, which to me makes him the best featherweight of all time. You're talking about one of the very best guys to ever do it, change the game, improve the game by virtue of his participation, lifted it in his home country to say whatever else he did overall, did it in 2 different weight classes, and even in this last fight, BC, although it's kind of a shame with his last fight ended up being what it was, even though his last fight was still very competitive in a different division in which he made his name, they will not come around like Jose Aldo very often. An unbelievable career. It comes to an end, at least in MMA, we think. He's one of the very best to ever do it.
And maybe, Luke, because he was all those things I mentioned, whereas, the King of Hio nickname is perfectly translatative. How about that? Wow. Into the whole idea that he's MMA royalty. He's so humble and so dedicated, right? Look at the way he turned his body around for this move to 135, that he may have sacrificed for himself a more, marketing heavy persona, but that was something that never mattered to him. So it's like, I almost respect him even more. I mean, he could have been a front page breakout star if he was a little bit more of a trash talker or, adapted to English earlier, but he always was who he was, which was great. So you watched his journey essentially from start to finish, maybe mirroring the same years of your professional career. Luke, what's his best win, but what's also your favorite in the Jose Aldo story?
Ooh. Best, I forgot what I had on my rundown list. I think we went through it there. I think forgot what my Jose Aldo favorite list is. The one that stands out to me top of the food chain, as you ask me now, would be the second Mendes fight. Yeah. The second Mendes fight, because he had more glorious wins. The first Mendes fight, the Swanson fight, the Faber fight, the Mike Thomas Brown fight. He had more glorious wins. But that one where he got pushed a little bit and nevertheless answered the call and then still kind of put it on Chad Mendes overall in the end, he had to do things that Lamas and Chan Sung Jung didn't really make him do, and then Chad Mendes kind of did, and he still was able to come out on top in a very difficult fight using all of his various skills, including that takedown defense, including obviously his incredible Muay Thai. That would be mine. What about you?
We talked a different countdown in the past where this was brought up, even though it wasn't a major win in his run. The body shot knockout to Jeremy Stevens, which was devastating, came at a point where he needed one of those reinventions I talked about after the 2 Holloway losses. And the joy he showed in that celebration was so pure that I remember thinking in the moment, I think he doubted himself just as much as we did. So that moment stands out big. I mean, the heart he showed, even in the losses to Holloway, just like the stand and I'm going to go out on my shield. And I mean, that embodied his career to me. He didn't always fight like that. We know that. Most often in his prime, he was moving downhill, controlling the terms. But that was what was going to be needed for him to have a chance to win both of those fights against Holloway, and he went there willingly. I love almost more, like I mentioned, the second half of his career because of, you know, the hurdles that he faced in age and defeat and how he always so deftly got around those and reinvented himself. But, you know, you can't look past the first round knockout against Mendes for just pure devastation in terms of like, is that the best we've ever seen of him? I mean, probably the best we've ever seen of him were those last few fights in the WEC when it just became clear that, like, you know, this is boss at the end of the video game type of dude. He's the boogeyman, you know, for this entire, you know, promotion. For he just had a killer vibe and instinct to him. But with a career this long, I mean, he faced everybody, right? So you can pick and choose. The only regret, Luke, and I still say this, is not getting in some form a McGregor rematch. Not didn't have to be immediate, although it obviously could have been, but in some form a chance to run back, because it ended up being not for a lack of trying, right? When he got knocked out in 12 seconds against McGregor, he actually landed a big punch simultaneously, but it ended up being obviously a low point considering the amount of trash talk he endured, the fact that fight got delayed because of injury, and then, you know, you finally have it. I would have liked to have seen him at least get a chance to save face, but the saving of face that he did in the Edgar fight right after that, in all the other reinventions, damn, Luke, you said it. If he's in your top 5, if he's your number 1, he's just that kind of dude that you really can't argue it. You really can't. I mean, do I think he's in that necessarily Silva, GSP, John Jones area of the GOAT talk? To me, he's a step down, but he does have one of those auras and resumes and reputations that you can't argue him in if that's your cup of tea at the end of the day. And a lot of people drank from that cup, Luke, rightfully so. I don't think he was ever tied into PED scandals, correct?
No, I don't think so. He was
I wonder if
he dynamic athlete.
Yeah, I always wondered if he smuggled all the drugs in that Mark Hominick ball that he created on his forehead so it can get past USADA officials. And you know, if that conspiracy's not true, God, he's what you want. Look, he's what you want your son to grow up to be if he gets into MMA, right?
Yeah, I mean, you would want anyone to be a fraction of good as he was. So, but let's talk about the other side of things here, and this is a genuine thing to explore for just a moment. How much did the McGregor loss hurt his legacy? You know, losing to Holloway definitely was a torch passing moment. Losing to Volkanovski took I heard the wind out of his sails at 145. It was after that when he lost to Volkanovski that he went on to fight Moraes at 135. So it ended up being an exit. I do think that people might have a higher opinion of him. Not just like if he had never fought McGregor and had his exact same record all the way through, I think he'd be held in slightly higher regard from the casual fan base perspective. True or false?
True. Definitely true. And it's funny that right after that, like, we didn't really have a ton of GOAT debates before that. Maybe it's because things like this show being on 3 days a week have fueled the need to have these discussions, and it certainly goes overboard. But, you know, people, if you asked people back then, before the Aldo McGregor fight in 2015, you know, who's the greatest? I mean, some would say GSP, some would say Anderson, whatever, but I feel like right after that, McGregor made this huge rise, and, you know, Rousey was leaving, and there was so much star power around at that time that we did start to say, like, is John Jones in front of our eyes the greatest? And maybe Jose got bumped down because, I mean, it was an embarrassing loss, Luke, and it's because of, you know, not because he fought awful, but because of all the trash talk and the build-up and this big moment where I think, you know, the core fans were like, okay, you're gonna serve this guy, you're gonna show this guy that he's just a loudmouth and he's not on your level. I think that's why that's one of the most shocking, if not the most shocking ending in UFC history. But it did diminish in that short term in the few years after. Maybe it's why I put him in that second 5 and I get a lot of criticism from the fans. I think it did drop him a stock. But look, I got to be honest, what he's done since then, as we just broke it down, I mean, that has to bump him back up to a certain degree, because most guys, when they get to the point of their greatness and how great they're going to be, and then they lose, and let's say it's in devastating fashion. In 4 fights, he got knocked out cold by McGregor and got stopped by Holloway twice. So, you know, guys don't come back from that. They don't. You know, they come back, they take a couple of fights, they might win or lose some, but nobody comes back from that and constantly rebuilds. We have to add that now retroactively into the total body of how we look at him. And I do think, as a lot of fighters, he'll be one of those fine wine legacies where, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think we'll be holding him a lot higher than maybe what that McGregor 1 fight, 1 knockout loss did in the short term to blind some of us, maybe me included, into just how great he really was.
Yeah, there's probably something to be said for that. And also, you know, Bantamweight, what he did was remarkable, but he never got a finish in Bantamweight. not like he was fighting chumps or something, but obviously his efforts down there were mixed. He lost obviously to Jan pretty badly. He lost technically to Moraes and obviously to Merab. Some of those being lackluster fights, and then the Jan fight was great, but then he got kind of polished off. And then he had solid wins, but it wasn't. This was the thing I always said about going to 135 for Jose. It extended his career, and I think it brought the fans back around him because what he did was admirable. But if you just look at the reality of what it did, like what was his campaign like at 135 versus what his campaign was like at 145, it didn't materially change anything. He was more or less kind of stuck in the same spot. Not good enough to win a championship, good enough to beat a lot of other guys. Pretty commendable place, but it wasn't like a upgrade for him. It was more or less the same. Still, to be that senior in your career and then that competitive, pretty remarkable. Hard to know what the bigger L was.
Right now, with the killers that bantamweight that this era has, for him to have been twice in the title discussion at that age is remarkable.
Oh, it's beyond. Yeah, it's extremely impressive. Again, I'm just pointing out like nothing was really hugely different for him in that sense. Bigger L, the McGregor loss or the tattoo he got last week, BC? Hard to really know. You know what I'm saying?
The McGregor loss. Because I think he could still add, like I'm always telling Tristan, our great cameraman, Luke, who will probably kill you in your sleep one day. He's got all of those animals in the wolves, and he needs connective tissue. He needs a dream catcher to connect them all together. I think if Jose adds something around that can some color, something that can take away the
he has to get it partially lasered and then get tattooed on top of it. That's what he has to do. There's no fixing that.
He's too proud to do that shit, Luke. All
so
right.
then let me ask you this. What is he? Jose Aldo currently sits at 36 years of age, just turned 36 in September. Would you like to see him box at all? Is that a thing you care about?
I mean, you got to ask yourself who. He's too small for a Jake Paul-sized guy. I mean, he's also kind of too small for to box Nate. I mean, I guess you could do something like that. But the question is, would it be are we looking at a Jose McGregor boxing match when both are 39? I mean, yeah, call me back. Look me up then, Luke. I'll probably be into it for all you know. But, I'm not against him trying to make money. I don't know. I just feel like he's going to fight one more time in the UFC, Luke. I kind of want to see him fight under the guise of, going back home, homecoming send-off. You know what I mean? A chance for him to jump the fence again and run through the crowd like he spectacularly did that one time. I mean, I kind of really want to see that.
Why do you think he retired with one fight left on his deal? My best read on this, BC, and tell me if you agree or not, is that everyone's like, oh, but the UFC is going back to Rio. Well, a couple things. Number one, he already fought in Rio a number of times. He fought in Rio against Max. He fought in Rio against Volkanovski, and you could be like, okay, well, he lost those two. He also fought in Rio against Chad. He fought in Rio against Chan Sung Jung. He fought in Rio against Chad Mendes the first time. He fought in Rio a fair number of times. It wasn't like he had never done it with the UFC, I'm pointing out, obviously. And then the other part is, I guess he was like, listen, if I'm not going to be fighting for a title, I don't want to just keep doing this bullshit. Yes, He could fight somebody else, but what the fuck is the point? Do you share my sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, his coach, who has been either brother or father to him this whole run, depending on the dynamics of the relationship, I mean, he came out publicly and said that. So, and that happens when a fighter feels like he's got a couple paydays left, but the team around him or the family is like, come on, enough is enough. You're everything. You've done everything. We don't need any more. I'm sure that played a part because I'm sure he respects those who spoke up about that. Yeah, I mean, I respect him more now for doing that. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's ultimately it.